Psychedium podcast by Psychedelic Magazine.
Imagine a substance, right, it can physically interrupt a severe years-long heroin addiction.
Yeah, and like almost overnight.
Right, almost overnight. But then, imagine that same exact substance carries this massive, well-documented risk of triggering a lethal cardiac event.
Yeah.
Like literally stopping your heart.
Which is terrifying.
It's completely terrifying. And finally, imagine that the United States government just threw $50 million at it and ordered federal health agencies to start getting it to patients in like a matter of weeks.
It sounds like science fiction, honestly.
It really does.
Yeah, it's a profound shock to the system. We are essentially witnessing this sudden, really aggressive acceleration of medical policy.
Right.
And it completely rewires how we handle some of the most, complex and misunderstood substances on the planet.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive today. We are pulling from this incredibly detailed article published in Psychedelic Magazine. It's titled, "The U.S. Government Has Stopped Fighting the Future." And what we're going to do is unpack the massive executive order signed on April 18th that, well, it effectively attempts to kick down the door for psychedelic medicine.
Kick the door right off its hinges, really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the stated goal here is to deploy these substances as this brand new weapon against the current mental health crisis, and specifically the veteran suicide epidemic.
Right. And it's important to note the document itself is dense. It's not just some, symbolic declaration that looks good on paper.
No, it has teeth.
Exactly. It fundamentally re-engineers the actual mechanical gears of the federal government, specifically targeting how the FDA and the DEA process and regulate psychedelic compounds.
But before we dive into all those crazy mechanics, we need to establish some guardrails for you, the listener. Because, look, this executive order was signed by President Trump, and the source article we're using, it really highlights the heavy direct influence of some incredibly polarizing figures.
Yeah, specifically Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Joe Rogan.
Right, Joe Rogan. So obviously there's an incredible amount of political noise surrounding this entire topic.
Oh, massive amounts.
But for the next 15 minutes or so, we're taking all that politics and we're putting it in a soundproof box.
I like that.
Yeah, because our only job today is to impartially report on the contents of the article provided. We aren't endorsing any administration's politics. We're not taking sides on any of the figures involved. None of that.
Yeah, we're just looking at the mechanical reality of the text. Like, what does this law actually do?
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. Because looking strictly at the mechanics, it is genuinely unprecedented.
It really is. And to understand the magnitude of what actually happened 4 days ago, you first have to understand the bureaucratic inertia that it's trying to dismantle.
Let's start right there. Because the most immediate practical change this executive order creates is that it just completely shatters the traditional timeline for drug approval.
Yeah, it breaks it entirely.
Right, because typically getting a new medical treatment through the FDA, it's this notorious, decade-long bottleneck. Why does it usually take so long just to get a green light?
Well, it comes down to the fundamental philosophy of the FDA, right? Which historically has been this extreme, really unflinching caution. The whole doctrine is, first, do no harm.
Right, which makes sense.
Of course it does. But practically what that means is taking a drug from the initial discovery phase, right, then through animal testing, into human safety trials.
Which takes years.
Years. Then into massive efficacy trials, and finally into this huge bureaucratic review process. The whole journey routinely takes 10 to 12 years.
Just a massive amount of time.
Yeah. And the standard paperwork review period at the FDA alone, just the final step where bureaucrats actually sit down and read the data, that usually takes 10 months.
10 months just to read the paperwork at the finish line of a 10-year marathon.
Exactly.
But this new executive order, it introduces something called Commissioner's National Priority Vouchers for breakthrough therapies. What does that actually mean for this crazy timeline?
So the breakthrough therapy designation is crucial here. That status is applied to treatments that show substantial, really significant improvement over existing therapies for serious conditions.
Okay, so it's a specific label.
Right. And currently, psilocybin holds this status for severe depression, and MDMA holds it for PTSD.
Got it.
What's fascinating here is that what this executive order actually does is mandate the FDA to aggressively prioritize these specific substances. The FDA commissioner, Marty Makary, he immediately issued 3 of these new priority vouchers.
Wow. So if you hold one of these vouchers, how fast does that traditional 10-month paperwork review become?
Well, according to the new directive, the agency is now targeting a review window of just 4 to 8 weeks.
Wait, 4 to 8 weeks from 10 months? That is just a breathtaking compression of time. I mean, we are talking about a federally legal, prescription-grade psychedelic potentially being available in a clinical setting before the end of 2026.
This year, yeah.
Literally this year. It's like the government is handing out a VIP fast pass at a crowded amusement park, just letting these specific drugs walk right past the 10-year line.
That's a great way to look at it.
But I have to ask, I mean, when we hit fast forward on substances that fundamentally alter human brain chemistry, what are we risking here? Why abandon that whole historical do no harm caution right now?
Well, the shift is entirely driven by a pretty grim recalculation of baseline risk.
What do you mean?
The administration is essentially looking at the data on treatment-resistant depression and the devastating rate of veteran suicides, and they're concluding that the current mental health crisis is an active emergency. The underlying logic here is that the risk of moving too slowly and losing thousands more lives to conditions that traditional SSRI antidepressants just aren't fixing that risk, now statistically outweighs the traditional risks of speeding up the approval process.
Oh, wow. So they're trading standard pharmaceutical caution for aggressive speed because they just deemed the status quo completely unacceptable.
Exactly. They're saying the house is on fire. We can't wait for the water to be purified before we throw it on the flames.
That makes a lot of sense. But, standardizing a fast track for well-studied drugs like MDMA is one thing. What happens when the government tries to fast track a drug that researchers are actively terrified of?
Right.
Because that brings us to the most controversial substance singled out in this entire executive order.
You are referring to ibogaine.
Yes, ibogaine.
Yeah.
Our source article spends a significant amount of time on this. It's derived from the root bark of the African iboga shrub, and it is being heavily spotlighted because of its reported ability to interrupt severe opioid addiction. And we're not just talking about, managing withdrawal symptoms here, right? How exactly does this work biologically?
The mechanism is fascinating, and it is very, very different from traditional addiction treatments.
Okay, how so?
Consider a standard treatment like methadone or Suboxone. Those drugs essentially replace the illicit opioid. They bind to the same receptors in the brain to prevent withdrawal and cravings, but the patient remains physically dependent on an opioid.
Right, they're just swapping one for a safer legal one.
Exactly. But ibogaine operates completely differently. Neurologically, it seems to interact with multiple neurotransmitter systems all at once, particularly the serotonin and dopamine pathways.
The article actually mentions it acts almost like a neurological reset.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. It is akin to doing a factory reset on a smartphone that is bogged down by a malicious virus.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Ibogaine appears to rapidly restore the brain's dopamine receptors closer to their pre-addiction state. So patients often report emerging from the psychedelic experience, which, by the way, can last for 24 hours or more.
Wait, a 24-hour trip?
Yes, it's intense. But they emerge without the physical cravings or acute withdrawal symptoms that make quitting opioids so excruciating.
I mean, a literal overnight factory reset for a heroin addiction sounds like a complete medical miracle.
Yeah.
But the article is very clear that there's a terrifying catch.
Very terrifying, yes.
Ibogaine has historically been pushed to the absolute fringes of medical research because of severe cardiovascular risks. Specifically, it can cause cardiac arrhythmias. Like we said at the start, it can literally stop a patient's heart.
Right. The medical community refers to it as prolonging the QT interval. And it is a very real, documented danger. Ibogaine is not a gentle substance, and the physical toll on the body during the administration is intense.
See, this is where I have to push back on the policy logic. We know this drug carries a lethal heart risk. The FDA knows this. Yet, the executive order is allocating a $50 million federal match for state-level ibogaine research.
Yep.
Furthermore, it expands the Right to Try Act, meaning patients with severe treatment-resistant addictions don't even have to wait for the final clinical trials to finish before taking it.
Which is a huge leap.
It's massive. So if the government sanctions this under a Right to Try program, and a veteran suffers a fatal heart attack in a clinic, isn't the blood now directly on the FDA's hands instead of, some underground clinic in another country? How can the government legally justify that liability?
This raises an important question, right? Because that tension between absolute safety and absolute desperation, that's the central conflict of this entire policy.
It used to be.
To understand the justification, you really have to look at the reality on the ground prior to April 18th. Veterans and others suffering from end-stage opioid addiction, they were already leaving the United States.
Just going to other countries.
Yeah, they were taking out massive loans to travel to less regulated clinics in Mexico or Costa Rica to undergo ibogaine therapy.
Just because traditional medicine told them there was literally nothing else to try.
Precisely. They felt they were facing a death sentence from their addiction anyway. So the policy shift here, including that $50 million federal match inspired by similar state-level funding in Texas, it's an acknowledgement of that dark reality.
Wow.
The government is arguing that vulnerable populations are already seeking out this highly risky treatment in the shadows. By bringing it under the umbrella of expanded right-to-try laws, the goal is to pull it into the light.
Okay, I see.
Right? So even if it is experimental, administering it domestically in a facility equipped with cardiac monitors and emergency resuscitation equipment, that is statistically safer than a patient doing it in an unregulated overseas clinic.
So they're betting that the mortality rate of untreated opioid addiction is vastly higher than the clinical risk of a monitored ibogaine session.
Yes, exactly. They are choosing the lesser of two extreme risks.
Okay, let's look at the logistics of how researchers are even supposed to get these substances into a domestic clinic.
Yeah, that's a whole other hurdle.
Right. Because even if you fast-track a drug with a priority voucher, and even if you give desperate patients a legal right to try it, there is still this massive, imposing legal wall that has stood in the United States for 50 years. I want to talk about how this executive order attempts to dismantle the Schedule I roadblock.
The Schedule I classification. It is the anchor holding all of this back.
Yep.
By definition, under the Controlled Substances Act, placing a drug in Schedule I means the federal government officially declares it has a high potential for abuse and, quote, no currently accepted medical use.
And as the article points out, that specific phrasing creates an absolute logistical nightmare for scientists. Explain what a researcher physically has to go through just to study a Schedule I drug.
The hurdles are just astronomical. Because it is Schedule I, a researcher cannot just, order a sample from a chemical supply company.
Yeah.
You need specialized DEA licenses that take years to acquire.
Years just for a license.
Oh, yeah. And you need rigorous background checks. You need to install literal multi-ton DEA-approved safes and advanced security systems in your laboratory just to legally hold a few grams of psilocybin.
That's insane.
It is. The bureaucracy is intentionally designed to be prohibitive. It creates this infamous catch-22, right? You need extensive clinical research to prove to the government that the drug has medical use, but you cannot easily conduct the research because the government classifies it as having no medical use.
Wow. But the source text is very clear that this new executive order does not unilaterally reschedule these drugs overnight.
Yeah.
The president did not just take a Sharpie and cross out the Schedule I classification.
No, legally, the president cannot do that. The rescheduling process is bound by statute, and it has to go through a formal administrative review involving the Attorney General and the DEA.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. How does the order fix that catch-22 without breaking the law?
It creates what the article refers to as a preemptive bridge.
A preemptive bridge.
Right. Under this new directive, the Attorney General is now required to initiate the formal rescheduling review process the exact moment a psychedelic drug completes its Phase 3 clinical trials.
Let's give a quick breakdown of what Phase 3 implies for you listening.
Yeah.
If a drug has made it to Phase 3, what do we already know about it?
By the time a drug enters Phase 3, it has already passed Phase 1 and Phase 2, meaning basic safety profiles and initial efficacy have been well established.
What?
Phase 3 is that final, massive, large-scale test on hundreds or thousands of patients to definitively prove that it works across a broad population.
Got it. So they are moving the legal finish line to match the medical finish line.
Yes. Historically, the FDA and the DEA were like two heavy freight trains operating on completely different schedules. The FDA train representing medical approval would finally arrive at the station after 10 years of research.
Right.
But the drug would just sit there on the platform, sometimes for years, waiting for the DEA train to arrive and actually change its legal status so doctors could prescribe it.
Which means the DEA could effectively stall a medical breakthrough indefinitely just by delaying their paperwork.
Yes. What this preemptive bridge does is force both trains to run on parallel tracks at the exact same speed.
Okay.
So by mandating the DEA to start their legal review while the FDA is finishing their final Phase 3 medical review, the bureaucratic friction is eliminated. The objective is that the very minute the FDA signs the medical approval, the DEA's legal rescheduling takes effect simultaneously. No more waiting on the platform.
So instead of waiting for the entire house to be built before applying for the zoning permits, the government is forcing the paperwork through while the paint is still drying.
Yes, that is a fantastic analogy.
That is an incredibly aggressive restructuring of how these agencies interact.
Mm.
But, with all of this discussion about VIP fast passes and parallel trains and expanding the right to try, we definitely need a serious reality check here.
We do.
Because someone listening to this right now might naturally assume the government is just paving the way for full recreational legalization, like it's a free-for-all.
Yeah, the article explicitly shuts that idea down. It draws a very, very hard line between medicalization and legalization. This is not the dawn of a legally sanctioned recreational psychedelic culture.
So you are not going to be walking into a neighborhood dispensary and buying a gram of MDMA next to the CBD gummies.
Absolutely not. The framework envisioned by this executive order is highly clinical. When these fast-track drugs do become available, they are destined for strictly controlled environments.
Like hospitals.
The administration envisions patients going into specialized psychiatric clinics or specific doctor's offices where the drug is administered under the direct, continuous supervision of licensed medical professionals.
So it is a controlled medical procedure. You don't just get a prescription in a little orange plastic bottle to take home and keep in your medicine cabinet.
Exactly. You stay in the clinic for the entire duration of the experience, guided by therapists, and then you go home.
But even with those clinical safeguards, there is intense criticism of this policy shift.
Oh, huge pushback. The primary criticism comes from the traditional scientific community regarding long-term data.
Right, because of the fast track.
Yes. When you compress a 10-year observational process into 4 to 8 weeks, you are willfully blinding yourself to the future. Critics argue that we simply do not possess the necessary 5-year or 10-year safety data on what these really powerful brain-altering compounds do to a wide demographic of patients over time.
That makes total sense. Like, will there be unforeseen personality changes? Will there be delayed neurological side effects?
Exactly. By prioritizing immediate access, the government is basically accepting that we will only discover those long-term consequences after the drugs are already in the public bloodstream.
And that willingness to bypass traditional pharmaceutical safeguards, it ties directly into the broader cultural shift the article identifies. The heavy involvement of figures like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Joe Rogan in shaping this executive order, it signals a major pivot toward alternative health and what the source calls disruptive medicine.
It is a profound departure from the established pharmaceutical playbook, and we are going to see it roll out first within the veteran community.
Right, the VA.
Yeah, the article highlights that the Department of Veterans Affairs has been specifically directed to collaborate extensively with private psychedelic researchers.
Meaning the VA system is going to serve as, like, the tip of the spear here. Veterans will likely be the first major demographic to receive widespread, federally subsidized access to therapies like MDMA or ibogaine.
Right. It takes the concept of psychedelic healing out of the underground, out of the foreign travel market, and places it squarely into mainstream, government-supported clinical pathways.
So bringing it all together, what does this all mean for you, the person listening right now, if you or someone in your life is battling severe PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, or a relentless addiction?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it means the era of feeling entirely abandoned by traditional medicine is fracturing. For decades, patients who didn't respond to standard antidepressants or addiction therapies were left to suffer or forced to seek out illegal, unregulated alternatives.
Yeah.
This executive order is the U.S. government making a historic, calculated gamble. They are officially betting that aggressive, disruptive innovation is the only viable exit strategy from a mental health crisis that has basically defeated the traditional medical establishment.
It is a stunning pivot. They are looking at the rising statistics of despair and deciding that bureaucratic caution is no longer a virtue, but it's actually a liability.
Exactly. And whether that gamble pays off or whether the lack of long-term safety data comes back to haunt the health system, well, that's something we will only discover in real time over the coming years as these priority vouchers translate into actual clinical practice.
It is going to be a wild, just totally unprecedented timeline to watch unfold. But as we wrap up our analysis of this policy, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, provocative thought to mull over. Something that builds on the incredible biological mechanisms we discussed today.
Go for it.
If these fast-track psychedelic therapies administered in tightly controlled clinical settings actually deliver on their promise, if they provide a true, lasting cure for severe depression or a permanent factory reset for opioid addiction after just 1 or 2 sessions,
Right.
how will that fundamentally disrupt the entire economic business model of the traditional pharmaceutical industry? I mean, an industry built almost entirely on requiring patients to purchase and take a daily maintenance pill for the rest of their lives just to manage symptoms.
That is the big question. If you cure the patient, you lose the customer. It is a question that threatens the very economic foundation of modern medicine.
It certainly does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking beneath the surface of the headlines, and we will catch you next time.